You know, the average person's like, is that a crow? Is that like, how can you see the chough and go, that is definitely a chough?
The easiest way to identify choughs from other species of crows are their red bills, red legs and feet. In flight, you can also tell the difference from other species of crow because they have really broad, deeply fingered wings, and choughs most of the time let you know they're around with their distinctive call.
When did you find out about the chough, and why did you then fall in love with it?
I first found out about choughs when I was studying at Bangor University, so just down the road. I wanted to understand more about the species, their biology and ecology, so I'd regularly come up to North Wales to look at them, where they're found and where they've been for hundreds of years, and just try and find out as much as I could. And that's where I started to learn more about the colour ringing project by Adrian Stratford and Tony Cross. I'd spend hours coming up here to look at colour rings on the legs of choughs to identify individual birds, so I could find out where they were from and how far they'd travelled from their natal site, and how far they were travelling from their nesting sites to find food for their young. So I was just obsessed from that point onwards. I fell in love with the landscape, the mountains and the coastlines whilst I was studying at Bangor, and I've always wanted to return. So when an opportunity arose to come back and to conserve the wildlife found in this landscape, I couldn't resist the offer. It's amazing to be able to help conserve choughs and other really special species of wildlife in North West Wales. Naturally, choughs nest in cavities, on cliffs, or in sea caves. However, in the Carneddau, they've taken advantage of the human influence on the landscape. So you'll find them nesting in quarries. So the quarry activities basically create artificial nesting sites for choughs.
If you kind of explain to us kind of that kind of life cycle of a chough, of what their year would be, when does it start? How do they start dating?
For any species of wildlife, the most critical period of time is the breeding season. For a chough, that's from late April to mid-July, where they're reproducing and then looking after young. So from mid-March, they'll start constructing their nests. Their nests are constructed from heather that they find on the heathlands, and then they usually line their nests with moss or sheep's wool. They usually complete their nests from anywhere between early April and mid-April. So once the nest is ready, then they'll lay their eggs, and it takes 3 weeks for the incubation phase to be completed, and then the chicks will hatch. In mid-May, most of the chough sites will have young within them. You could be out in the Carneddau and you'll come across chough fledglings constantly harassing their parents for food. It could be quite comical to watch. And sometimes they won't even be demanding food from their parents. They'll be trying to get food from either other breeding pairs in the flock, or even members of the sub-adult flocks, which the breeding pairs will congregate with.
Can you explain that a little bit, the idea of, so we're saying that once they've left the nest, they'll go out with their parents, and the parents will forage with the fledgling, but then they move to this juvenile stage, and then what do you mean by these little kind of juvenile flocks?
Choughs have a complex social structure. So before they start breeding, at 2 or 3 years old, they congregate together in sub-adult flocks. This is where they learn from other juvenile birds how to forage and where to forage. It basically acts as a nursery. So eventually the parents will get fed up of looking after their children and decide it's now up to the chicks to look after themselves, and in effect leave them with the sub-adult flock to look after them. By this stage, the fledglings can feed themselves and they can look after themselves, but it's an important part of their development because they'll certainly learn important locations for foraging from those individuals in the sub-adult flock, and potentially even be building up an understanding of how to find food at different times of the year. It's also where widow birds will find themselves a new mate. So if a bird's partner dies, they can find a subadult flock and get themselves a new partner which they can take back to their nesting site.
Well, let's talk about mums and dads, parents. I know that they are monogamous. So can you go into a little bit about how long that lasts? How is it for a lifetime? You mentioned before about how, if they're widowed, they find another mate. Yeah, can you talk us about their pairing?
Choughs are monogamous, which means they pair for life. So although there are exceptions, usually you'll find breeding pairs staying together for many, many, many years. In Penmaenmawr Quarry, there's a breeding pair which has been together for 18 years, and they've been a couple since they were 2. They were both birds born on Anglesey, obviously met in a subadult flock, and then decided to take up residence in Penmaenmawr Quarry.
Do they normally stay with just their mates? Or do they still hang out with all the...
No, they will hang out with the others. I guess there's an advantage to hanging out with your friends if they're better at finding food than you. Mm-hmm. They're very social birds. They're always communicating with each other. And hanging around in a group is also a useful way of avoiding predators, because if there's more of you, you can be more vigilant. And if the flock was attacked by a predator, there's less chance that you're going to get predated if you're hanging around in a group. The oldest chough recorded in Wales is 25 years old. That bird is still alive, and they nest on Anglesey.
So we're talking at least 23, 24 different...
Potentially it's had 23 generations of young. They would be a great, 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 great grandfather.
That's amazing. What about any unusual, not so monogamous choughs? Is that known anywhere?
Yeah, occasionally you'll find trios of choughs. They act in completely the same way as a breeding pair, but there's just an extra bird, which usually is really beneficial to the relationship, because there's more in terms of reproduction, because there's more birds to feed the young chicks. There are cases of divorce in birds, unfortunately. For whatever reason, sometimes you will have males or females stealing mates from other breeding pairs. But by and large, they are monogamous, highly faithful birds.
We've got quite a lot of choughs in our area. Why is it so important to look after those choughs?
We're really lucky in this part of Wales. You can go for a walk in the mountains, you can go for a walk along the coastline, and there's a high chance of seeing a chough. You could go to other parts of the UK and you'd have no chance. For example, in England, the only place you'd find them is in Cornwall. In Scotland, you wouldn't find them on the mainland. You'd have to go to either Islay or Colonsay in the Inner Hebrides. But you can come to Wales and you can go somewhere and find them. And we have a high responsibility to maintain that population. There's only 400 breeding pairs of choughs in the UK and Isle of Man. And it's really important that we maintain that number. There's fewer breeding pairs of chough than there are golden eagles in the UK. Wales is a stronghold, and it's really important that we conserve their nesting and foraging habitat, so they continue to be here, and we can continue to go out into the countryside and see them. Intrinsically, they're a fantastic part of the landscape. And
this is kind of like a two-part question. What can be done to help them, and what can just the average person do to help?
We've seen over the last century huge changes in the way land is managed, and traditional foraging sites for chough and many other bird species has been lost, which means that the areas of suitable chough foraging habitat is getting smaller and smaller. It's really important that we maintain those. so they continue to have somewhere to feed. Fundamentally, we need to know where the choughs are in terms of nesting and foraging habitat, and that's where anybody can help really, because you can help us monitor those species. And yeah, that's the only way we can really ensure that those places continue to exist for choughs, is by understanding where you can find them, and anyone can help do that.